In 1950s Britain, loving the wrong person wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was a criminal offense. The law did not distinguish between the famous and the forgotten. It did not care how many cinemas had your name above the door or how many millions had bought a ticket to see your face. For a generation of British screen legends, the price of authenticity was everything they had built. One of them protected her truth for more than 5 decades. Another carried hers to the grave. 10 women, 10 hidden costs. And the last name on this list will genuinely stop you cold. Stay with us. Number 1. Pamela Stephenson.
Pamela Stephenson arrived on British television in the late 1970s and proceeded to dismantle every expectation the industry had about what a woman in comedy was permitted to do. On Not the 9 O'Clock News, she matched Rowan Atkinson beat for beat and frequently surpassed him. She was fearless, technically precise, and completely without vanity, willing to do whatever the material demanded. The public adored her. The press was consumed by her high-profile marriage to Billy Connolly, one of Scotland's most beloved comedians. What the press did not fully reckon with during that period was the complexity of Stephenson's inner life. She has spoken in her own words, through interviews and writing, about the immense psychological weight of navigating a public persona that was never permitted to be the whole truth. That weight became, in her own telling, part of what drove one of the most remarkable mid-career pivots in British entertainment history. In the 1990s, she stepped away from performance entirely and trained as a clinical psychologist. She went on to become a practicing therapist and author, specializing in the psychological damage caused when people are forced to conceal their authentic selves under sustained social pressure. Her book, Bravemouth, A Portrait of Life with Connolly, was a bestseller. But her clinical work told its own story. A woman who understood from the inside precisely what it costs to perform a version of yourself for an audience that is not ready for the real.
Number 2. Amanda Barry. Amanda Barry is one of the most beloved figures in British television history, with a career spanning more than 6 decades. Her comic timing, particularly as Alma Halliwell on Coronation Street, made her a permanent fixture in the national consciousness. She was warmth itself on screen, approachable, funny, entirely without pretension. In 2014, she told the full story in her memoir, It's Not a Rehearsal. For more than 30 years, she had concealed a fundamental part of her private life. She was attracted to women. During the years when Coronation Street demanded a clean, traditional image from its cast, and when the tabloid press would have treated any deviation as front-page ammunition, she kept that truth locked away. She was married for many years to the theatrical director Robin Hunter. She has been clear in her own words that the marriage provided a degree of social cover during a period when she had no alternative she could safely take. She watched the women she cared about most being introduced to the public as simply close friends. Every interview was managed. Every public appearance was calculated. The fear of a single misplaced word or a whispered rumor sat on her every single day of it. When she finally published her memoir, the response was not the scandal she had spent decades dreading. The public by then was ready. Amanda Barry, in her 80s and openly happy, is proof that the truth has a timing of its own, and that arriving at it, however long the road, is worth every step. Mid-roll C to We are halfway through this list, and it is only getting more extraordinary from here. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Golden Age Files covers these hidden histories week after week, and the next entry is one that has never been told quite like this. Subscribe and keep watching. Number 3. Marianne Faithfull. Marianne Faithfull in the 1960s was one of the most photographed women in Britain. The face, the voice, the famous associations with the Rolling Stones, with the counterculture, with an era that presented itself as liberated while quietly enforcing its own rigid hierarchies. She was treated, as she has said herself, more as an accessory to rock mythology than as an artist in her own right. The complexity of Faithfull's private life during those years, the relationships, the periods of crisis, the survival, has been documented across decades of interviews and her 1994 autobiography, Faithfull. What emerges from the full record is a picture of a woman whose emotional landscape was considerably richer richer and more varied than the tabloid, shorthand of Mick Jagger's girlfriend or rock casualty ever captured. The women in her circle during her most difficult years, the late 1960s and 1970s, formed, by her own account, some of her most sustaining relationships. Not all of it made it into headlines, not all of it was meant to. She rebuilt. The voice that emerged on Broken English in 1979, raw, weathered, uncompromising, carried the weight of everything she had survived. Marianne Faithfull continued recording and performing for decades after the press had written her off. She was one of the great survivors of her era, and the full complexity of her life is now understood as inseparable from the art. Number 4, Coral Browne. Coral Browne was one of the great theatrical presences of mid-20th century Britain. Australian-born, she conquered the West End with a combination of dazzling technique and a wit so sharp it could draw blood at 20 paces. She was a queen of the stage throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Designer clothes, devastating one-liners, and an effortless authority in any room she entered. Browne managed her private life with the same precision she brought to a stage performance. She was well known within trusted theatrical circles for the complexity of her personal affections, but she understood, as every serious actress of her generation understood, that the newspaper editors of that era required a specific kind of story from their female subjects, and that deviating from it carried consequences. She gave them the story they wanted. She married prominent men. She attended the right events. She was unfailingly entertaining in every public context, which had the useful secondary effect of keeping attention focused on her performance, rather than her private life. Her legendary wit was not merely personality. In the context of mid-century British public life, it was also armor. After her death in 1991, the full texture of her private life became better understood among those who had known her. Today, Coral Browne is remembered for her brilliant stage work and for the extraordinary discipline it took to live an authentic private life inside a world that was not prepared to accommodate it. Number 5, Rachel Roberts. Rachel Roberts was one of the most viscerally powerful actresses of the British New Wave. Her performances in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning and This Sporting Life established her as a force of nature, raw, earthy, emotionally unguarded in ways that made audiences genuinely uncomfortable. She won the BAFTA for Best Actress for This Sporting Life in 1963. It was a rare recognition of the kind of unglamorous, relentless, emotional honesty that the British film industry didn't always know what to do with. Her marriage to Rex Harrison was, by all public accounts, the defining and turbulent relationship of her life. The press covered it extensively. What they did not have access to were the private diaries Roberts kept throughout her life, journals published posthumously, which revealed a woman of far greater complexity than the tragic wife narrative that the tabloids preferred. Those diaries documented her emotional landscape with unflinching honesty. The private connections that provided genuine refuge during the most difficult years of her marriage. The relationships that gave her, in her own words, something real and sustaining, were invisible to the outside world throughout her career. The psychological weight of maintaining that separation fed directly into her work. The anguish she brought to her greatest performances was not manufactured. Rachel Roberts died in 1980. The world lost one of the genuinely extraordinary screen talents of her generation. The diaries she left behind completed the portrait. Number 6, Miriam Margolyes. Miriam Margolyes is one of the most beloved figures in British public life. The enormous voice, the absolute refusal to be dull, the capacity to say in public precisely what everyone else is merely thinking. She has been a presence on British stages and screens since the 1960s and has achieved something rare. She has become more popular with age. The personal truth at the center of her private life was one she kept carefully guarded for decades. In the late 1960s, she met the woman who would become the love of her life, the historian Heather Sutherland. They have been together for well over 50 years. For most of that time, the relationship was invisible to the public. When Margolyes first attempted to tell her parents the truth, the response was devastating. It was, by her own account, a wound that never fully healed, and a lesson in exactly what the entertainment world might do with the same information. So she hid brilliantly. She attended award ceremonies alone. She dazzled talk show hosts with outrageous stories. She became the loudest, most entertaining, most thoroughly distracting person in any room, keeping cameras and journalists focused entirely on her performance. She came out publicly in her memoir This Much Is True, published in 2021. The response was warmth and admiration. Today, Miriam Margolyes and Heather Sutherland are celebrated as one of the great enduring partnerships in British public life. The woman who spent decades performing fearless honesty about everything, except the single most important fact about herself, has finally closed that gap entirely. Number 7. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was, without question, the most famous woman in Britain through much of the 1950s. Platinum hair, spectacular screen presence, a personality so large and so deliberately constructed that it functioned as its own force field. She was the British studio system's answer to Marilyn Monroe. She understood better than almost anyone how to manage the press by giving them more than they could handle. The tabloids were so utterly consumed by Diana's chaotic marriages, her scandals, her spectacularly public controversies, that they never looked carefully enough at what was happening behind closed doors. Her private gatherings at her estate in Maidenhead were famous within a trusted inner circle, events where the rigid rules of conservative British society simply did not apply, and where Diana Dors was not a glamorous symbol or a tabloid headline, but simply entirely herself. Those who knew her well have spoken, in the years since her death, about the genuine complexity of her private emotional life and the female companions who gave her something the relentless spotlight never could: peace, real understanding, and a sanctuary from the noise. Her commercial value rested entirely on her image as the ultimate expression of conventional glamour. Any deviation from that image, had it become public, would have been commercially catastrophic. Diana Dors died in 1984 of ovarian cancer at 52. She was far more complicated, far more intelligent, and far more courageous than any of the headlines ever captured. She took much of the full story with her. Those who truly knew her understood it. Number 8. Fiona Shaw. Fiona Shaw is one of the greatest stage actresses of her generation, arguably of any generation. Her classical work at the National Theatre and the RSC set a standard that very few performers have approached. Her Electra, her Richard II, her Medea, performances that left critics scrambling for language adequate to what they had witnessed. Entering the fiercely competitive British theatrical world of the 1980s, Shaw understood the rules immediately. The scrutiny of the contemporary press meant that deviation from conventional norms could damage a serious career before it had properly established itself. She constructed a precise and exhausting wall between her professional life and her private reality, and she maintained it for years. She and the actress Saffron Burrows were reported as close companions through much of the 1990s and early 2000s, their relationship carefully presented to the public as an unusually close friendship. The paparazzi culture of that era was merciless. A single unguarded moment of genuine affection could have ignited a media response that neither of them needed. Shaw eventually stepped forward, embraced her truth openly, and went on to find lasting happiness. She has spoken in interviews about the relationship between the suppressed reality of her private life and the emotional power she brought to her greatest stage roles. The theatre as the one environment where the intense passion she was required to suppress elsewhere could be fully and freely expressed. Today, Fiona Shaw is recognized as one of the great actors of her era and increasingly as a figure who navigated one of the most demanding periods in British public life with extraordinary intelligence and grace. Number 9. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh was one of the most worshipped actresses who ever lived. Her performance as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind remains one of the most iconic in cinema history. As Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, both on stage and on screen, she delivered a portrait of psychological disintegration that has never been surpassed. She was the absolute jewel of the British theatrical establishment. Her marriage to Laurence Olivier was treated by the adoring public as a genuine royal love story. The perfect golden couple, the ultimate symbol of British elegance and romantic devotion. The press celebrated them endlessly. What the press never saw was the immense, grinding emotional turbulence that ran constantly beneath that polished surface. Within the exclusive and tightly guarded circles of 1950s and 1960s London society, Those closest to Lee understood that the emotional landscape of her private life was considerably more complex than the public portrait suggested. She formed deeply intense and meaningful bonds with other remarkable women, bonds that provided the tenderness and genuine understanding that her famous marriage, by multiple accounts, often failed to provide in private. These relationships were conducted with extraordinary care, entirely shielded from public scrutiny. Lee also suffered from what would today be recognized as bipolar disorder, a condition that was poorly understood and frequently stigmatized during her lifetime, and which placed an additional and relentless strain on every aspect of her existence. The stakes of any public revelation were almost impossibly high. So she used her legendary glamour as armor, hosted glittering parties that dazzled the international elite, and gave the world the flawless performance it demanded. Vivien Leigh died in 1967. She carried the full complexity of her truth with her. The world continues to worship the performances and the beauty. Beneath them lived a restless, deep, passionate, and extraordinarily courageous woman who sought love in all the places a profoundly judgmental era told her she could never go. Charlotte Rampling. And here is the name that changes the shape of this entire list. Charlotte Rampling exists in a category entirely her own. The haunting eyes, the cool and almost otherworldly beauty, the aura of unshakable mystery that made her the chosen subject of the most daring directors in European cinema across 5 decades. Luchino Visconti, Liliana Cavani, François Ozon, Woody Allen. She was not a star in the conventional Hollywood sense. She was something rarer and more dangerous. An actress whose presence on screen implied that there was always something more being withheld. For much of that extraordinary career there was, immersed in the wildly experimental atmosphere of swinging London and the European art cinema of the 1970s, Rampling moved through a world that proclaimed radical personal freedom with passionate enthusiasm while simultaneously and ruthlessly policing the private lives of its most valuable female names behind the scenes. She was celebrated for her striking androgyny, her fearless visual boldness, the deliberate and powerful ambiguity she projected in every role she accepted. What audiences sensed as pure artistic rebellion was, in many deeply personal ways, a statement she was not yet able to make directly. She has spoken in later interviews about the fluid and complex nature of her full romantic history, about the deep emotional connections with women she quietly maintained throughout decades of publicly celebrated marriages, connections she cloaked behind the entirely unsuspicious label of platonic friendship. The international tabloid media of the 1970s and 1980s had very few ethical boundaries and enormous power. If those editors had confirmed the genuine nature of her most intimate female relationships, they would have weaponized that information without hesitation. So Charlotte Rampling gave them the neat, conventional story they demanded, while quietly maintaining an emotional landscape far more complex and far more genuine than the one the public was permitted to see. The chilling, almost unbearable emotional intensity she brought to her most celebrated performances, The Night Porter, Stardust Memories, 45 years, drew directly from that hidden complexity. Charlotte Rampling on screen has always been a woman carrying something she cannot quite bring herself to say aloud. For many, many years of her real life, she genuinely was. It was only much later, with the earned confidence of a woman who has survived everything the world could throw at her, that she began to speak with quiet, unapologetic honesty about her full romantic history. No performance, no drama. Simply the truth of a woman who had finally decided she was done constructing a version of herself for anyone's benefit but her own. She is, in every meaningful sense of the word, the real thing. One era, 10 women. The law gave them no choice. The studios gave them no space. The press gave them no mercy. They chose survival, but they never stopped loving. If their stories moved you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more hidden histories from the Golden Age, the stories behind the stories, the lives that never made it into the fan magazines, subscribe to the channel. We'll be here telling the truth.